I'm Emily Lawson, 34 years old, and I can still remember the sound of laughter echoing through that dining room, the kind that isn't warm or kind, but polished and cruel. My sister-in-law looked straight at me across the table, her diamond bracelet catching the light, and said, "Pay for it." Not as a question, not as a request, but as an order. Around her, 20 people in silk and smugness chuckled like it was a family tradition. My husband looked down at his plate. No one came to my defense, not even him. That was the night I realized the family I married into would never see me as one of their own. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever learned the hard way that generosity without respect isn't kindness at all. I wasn't born into this kind of wealth. My parents, Margaret and Dean, raised me in a small town where holidays meant folding chairs around the table and mismatched china stacked carefully to hide the chips. My father worked 2 jobs after the recession, and my mother taught piano to neighborhood kids. They taught me that money is earned, not flaunted, and that gratitude counts more than appearance. When I met Daniel at a conference 8 years ago, he was quiet, self-effacing, the kind of man who listened before speaking. His steadiness drew me in. I never imagined that behind his calm charm stood a family that treated every gesture as a transaction. The Crawfords were old Charleston money houses with marble foyers, cars they changed like wardrobes, and a social calendar printed months in advance. They loved perfection, the way some people love power obsessively and without mercy. Patricia, my mother-in-law, ran her home like a stage set, candles lit, pearls clasped, and smiles rehearsed. At first I thought I could fit in if I just tried harder. I wore the right dresses, remembered everyone's birthdays, and stayed polite when Patricia introduced me as Daniel's wife. She works in finance as though my name were a footnote. The first few times I paid for dinner, it felt harmless. "You probably have this covered, Emily. You're good with numbers," someone would joke when the check arrived. It sounded flattering enough, and I told myself it was no big deal. But over time, the pattern became clear. Whenever the bill appeared, eyes slid toward me. Forgotten wallets, misplaced purses, conveniently maxed-out cards, all recurring acts in the Crawford comedy. I convinced myself it was fine. I had a good job after all. I could afford it. What I couldn't afford was what it cost my dignity. Daniel would squeeze my hand under the table and whisper, "You're amazing, thank you." For a while that was enough. I wanted his family to see me as capable, generous, dependable. Instead, they began to see me as available. The line between kindness and exploitation blurred so slowly, I almost missed it. Then one night, over cocktails at a rooftop restaurant, I mentioned my promotion, Vice President of Financial Strategy. Silence followed. No congratulations, no toast. Madison changed the subject to her spa retreat. Patricia asked if the appetizers were gluten-free. I smiled, swallowed the ache, and handed my card to the waiter when the check came for $1,380. After that night, something in me started to unravel quietly. I noticed the small things I had ignored, the way Patricia dismissed my opinions with a sweet smile, the way Madison copied my ideas and took credit, how Daniel's voice softened whenever his mother disapproved of something I said. He'd tell me they're just particular, as if cruelty could be excused by habit. But particular became the word that erased me each time they forgot to include me in family photos, each time a brunch reservation had 6 chairs instead of 7. Still, I kept showing up. I baked cakes for their birthdays, organized spreadsheets for Christmas gifts, stayed up until 3 wrapping boxes that never bore my name. I bought Patricia a handbag she'd admired in a magazine, a small luxury that cost a week's paycheck. She opened it, glanced once, and said, "It's a nice imitation." Daniel didn't defend me. He only whispered, "Don't take it personally." I told myself that patience would earn acceptance, that love meant giving until it was noticed. But the more I gave, the less they saw me. I became the woman who planned, paid, and quietly disappeared into the background of their polished lives. What began as inclusion turned into expectation. Somewhere along the line, I stopped being a wife and became a resource. Every smile felt rehearsed, every thank you hollow, every dinner an unspoken test I could never pass. I learned to measure silence like interest accrued growing heavier by the month. When I looked around that table and saw the laughter bouncing off crystal glasses, I realized I wasn't part of a family gathering. I was funding it. And yet I stayed. Because I thought love required endurance, because I believed Daniel would one day draw the line, because walking away felt like failure. I didn't know that real failure was losing yourself so slowly you didn't notice until there was nothing left to lose. That night, after the party ended and everyone's laughter faded down the hall, I sat alone in our car, hands still trembling. I looked at the restaurant lights reflecting in the windshield and thought, they don't even know what they've done. But deep down I knew this couldn't continue. Something had to change. What I didn't realize then was that the next invitation, the next family event, would be the moment everything I'd silently endured would reach its breaking point. And when it did, the silence I'd kept for years would end with one sentence that none of them would ever forget. After that night, I tried to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe Madison hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Maybe I was reading too much into the silence that followed, but the truth didn't take long to show itself. The next family dinner came only 2 weeks later, a long table at a country club filled with polished silverware, polite laughter, and the smell of steak and truffle butter. As soon as the waiter placed the check down, it landed in front of me without a word. Nobody even looked surprised. Daniel's mother lifted her wine glass, smiled faintly, and said, "Emily, you're good with this, right?" I nodded, because that's what I'd always done. It became a rhythm I didn't notice myself keeping. Every time we went out, it was understood that I would take care of things. At first I told myself it was fine, I made good money, and it wasn't worth making a scene over a dinner bill. But soon it was everything: birthday gifts for nieces and nephews, spa packages, hotel reservations for family trips. When Madison planned a weekend in Aspen, she accidentally put my name on the invoice, sending a quick text that read, "Hope you don't mind. It's easier this way." I paid without question. Each time I thought it would be the last. There was one night I'll never forget. We were out celebrating my promotion, the one I'd worked years to earn. I had just been named vice president of finance at my firm, something I had dreamed about since grad school. When the announcement popped up online, I smiled and showed Daniel the post. He congratulated me, softly squeezed my hand, but at that table his parents, his sister, her husband, not one person said a word, not even a polite "that's wonderful." Instead, Patricia turned the conversation toward the restaurant's decor, and Madison asked if anyone had tried the wine list. The silence stung more than I wanted to admit, and still when the bill came, it found its way to me. I remember glancing down at the total $1,380 and sliding my card across the table like it was expected of me. After that, Daniel stopped saying thank you. He used to whisper it when no one was listening, a quiet acknowledgement that I was holding everything together. But somewhere along the way, even that stopped. When I asked him once if we could split things more evenly, he sighed and said, "They're just used to a certain way of doing things, Em. It's easier not to make it awkward. Easier for him, maybe." For me, it felt like standing outside in the rain pretending I couldn't feel it. At home, the imbalance showed up in smaller ways. Daniel still had one of his bank accounts linked to his mother for emergencies. Decisions about holidays or vacations were run through her first, even though we were adults with our own home. Whenever I suggested we try something different, a new restaurant, a simpler gathering, he'd look uneasy, as if my ideas threatened the family order. Patricia would smile that polite, tight smile of hers, and Madison would laugh as if I'd said something ridiculous. I learned to stop suggesting. That Christmas, I stayed up until 3 a.m. wrapping 37 gifts. None of them were from me. They were all tagged with Madison's name or Daniel's parents' names, and I had paid for nearly half. When Madison saw the piles under the Crawford tree, she clapped her hands and said, "You're so good at this, Emily, like a real little elf." Everyone laughed, and I did too, but only because I didn't know what else to do. I had become invisible in plain sight, the person who kept the family machine running while pretending it was a privilege. A few weeks later, I bought Patricia a leather handbag she had once admired in a magazine. It was expensive, even on sale, but I wanted to do something kind, something that might finally make her see me as more than Daniel's wife with a wallet. When she unwrapped it, she smiled and said, It's a nice imitation before setting it aside." My heart sank. Daniel caught my expression but didn't say a word. Later, when I brought it up, he told me, "Don't take it personally. She's particular." That was his word for everything. When they excluded me from family photos, particular. When they forgot to include my name on invitations, particular. It became his excuse for every small cruelty that chipped away at me. The first real crack appeared during a family trip to Napa Valley. Patricia had arranged everything down to the vineyard tours and matching outfits for photos. But when we arrived, there was a mistake with the hotel booking one fewer room than needed. Without hesitation, Daniel offered to share the fold-out couch with me in the suite, while Madison and her husband took the king-sized bed overlooking the vineyard. "You're so easygoing," Patricia said as she handed me a pillow. "It's such a blessing." I smiled because I had to, even as I lay awake that night listening to laughter drift down the hallway from their suite. Over time, the gratitude I used to feel turned into something else, an ache I couldn't name. I kept telling myself that family meant compromise, that marriage meant understanding. But deep down, something small and steady inside me began to whisper, "No." At first it was just a thought. I pushed aside the quiet voice that told me this wasn't normal, that respect shouldn't have to be purchased. The moment that whisper turned into resolve happened the night I got the flu. I canceled brunch with the Crawfords thinking they'd understand. No one called, no one texted to check on me. A week later, Madison sent a message that said, "Wow. Thanks for bailing. Real classy. No hope you're better, no kindness. Just disappointment that I hadn't shown up to decorate her daughter's birthday party, like I always did for free." I remember staring at the text, realizing that I could have been in the hospital, and it wouldn't have made a difference. I started noticing how often I was the only one giving. When Daniel forgot to plan something, I handled it. When Madison overspent, I covered it. When Patricia wanted to host an event, I organized it. Each favor stacked quietly on top of the last until the weight of them became unbearable. That's when I started keeping track. Not out loud, not in confrontation, but privately, like a mental ledger I could no longer ignore. Every dinner, every forgotten wallet, every thank you that never came. I didn't need to write it down to know the truth, but part of me wanted proof. Proof that this wasn't all in my head. Eventually, I opened my laptop and began typing. I made columns for dates, events, amounts, and who benefited. I went through old bank statements, receipts, credit card records. The total was staggering 78 events over 3 years, adding up to more than $91,000. I stared at that number for a long time. It didn't make me angry. It made me tired. That night, as Daniel slept beside me, I realized I didn't know who I was trying to impress anymore. They didn't love me for who I was. They loved what I gave. And for the first time, I started to believe I'd given enough. The next morning, I made coffee and watched the steam rise from the cup, curling into the quiet air. I didn't have a plan yet, only a promise forming deep inside the next time they handed me a bill, I wouldn't pick it up. I'd pick myself instead. When the invitation arrived for Daniel's parents' vow renewal embossed in gold, I knew it would be the test. Patricia's text followed days later, cheerful and clipped. "Mom expects perfection. Can we count on you for the wine tab again?" I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the old instinct to say yes. Then I typed a single word. "Sure." Not because I meant it, but because this time I was ready to end the game on my own terms. That dinner would be the turning point, the night when every quiet sacrifice I had ever made would surface in one unforgettable moment. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what would happen when the silence finally broke. By the time Daniel's parents' vow renewal approached, I had already built a quiet rhythm of pretending everything was fine. That was what the Crawfords expected: polish over truth, civility over honesty. I knew the evening would be grand. Patricia's events always were. Still, part of me hoped that maybe this one would feel different, that 40 years of their marriage might bring out something softer in them. It didn't. The restaurant was one of those places with marble floors that echoed every heel in soft jazz, curling through the air like perfume. 2 long tables stretched across the private dining room, draped in white linen lined with candles that flickered like they had been trained to. Everyone was there, extended relatives, old friends, business partners. It was the kind of night that begged for photographs for the appearance of grace and wealth. I wore black, quiet, and simple while Madison swept in wearing red like she was the centerpiece. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks 3 times before we were seated. The night began smoothly enough. Toasts were made, speeches delivered, laughter carried around the table like champagne bubbles. I poured my own water, smiled at strangers, and waited for it to be over. When dessert arrived, the waiter placed a small leather folio in the center of the table. Madison reached for it first, scanned the total with an exaggerated gasp, then turned to me. "Who knew? Love cost so much," she said loud enough for the table to hear. "Go ahead. Emily, pay for it." Laughter broke out instantly. Even Patricia chuckled into her glass. Daniel stared at his plate. It was a familiar sound that polished laughter, but this time something in me stayed very still. I folded my napkin neatly and set it down. Then I stood. The chair scraped across the marble floor, and just like that, the laughter stopped. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You want me to pay," I said quietly. "All right, let's talk about what I've already paid." I reached into my purse and took out a white envelope I had sealed that morning. Every head turned as I slid it across the table toward Madison. For a long second, no one moved. Then she smirked, trying to keep her tone light. "Emily, it's a joke. Lighten up." I met her eyes steady and calm. "Inside that envelope," I said, "is a record of every major expense I've covered for this family over the last 3 years. Dinners like this one, trips, parties, spa weekends, even preschool tuition." A hush spread through the room. Patricia's glass stopped midair. Daniel's face had gone pale. Madison opened the envelope, flipping through the pages. I saw the moment her expression changed from smug amusement to disbelief. "That total," I continued, "is $97,640.18, not counting tonight." A low murmur rippled down the table. Someone whispered, "You're kidding." No one laughed now. Patricia recovered first, her voice sharp as crystal. "This is incredibly disrespectful," she said. "You're embarrassing yourself." I shook my head. "No, I'm freeing myself." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. I looked around the table at faces I'd spent years trying to please. "You've treated me like a bank with a smile on it," I said. "Not a wife, not a daughter-in-law, not family, just someone convenient." And I let it happen. Madison's jaw tightened. "You seriously tracked every dollar I did," I answered, "because you never noticed the time, the effort, the money, because you never asked how I was doing or if I was okay. You just took." I reached for a small box beside my plate, the gift I had wrapped for Patricia. "This was supposed to be for you," I said. "A watch you once mentioned wanting. But I think I'll keep it." Patricia's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Daniel looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. I turned to him, my voice quiet but steady. "I'm done, Daniel. Whether you follow me or not, I'm walking out of here with my dignity. That's more than anyone at this table has ever given me." For a moment, no one moved. The candles flickered. The jazz in the corner continued as if the room weren't holding its breath. Then I picked up my clutch and stepped away. Patricia reached for Daniel's arm like she always did, as if she could reel him back under her control. He didn't move. As I walked toward the exit, my heels clicked across the marble in perfect rhythm, echoing louder than any applause could. Just before I reached the door, I turned slightly and said, "By the way, I booked this restaurant for you. The deposit was non-refundable. So technically, you've already used me tonight. Congratulations." No one said a word. I didn't look back. The door closed behind me with a soft sound that felt final. The drive home was quiet. I didn't cry or shake. I just drove, the city lights blurring through the windshield like a reflection of everything I was leaving behind. When I got home, I slipped off the heels, pulled the pins from my hair, and dropped the dress I'd chosen so carefully into a donation bag. I brewed a cup of tea and sat on the floor watching the steam rise in slow spirals. It felt like something was burning away, not pain exactly, but permission. The next morning, the phone started buzzing before sunrise. 6 missed calls from Daniel, then a text, "Please just talk to me." I set the phone down without answering. A few minutes later came Patricia's message. "That was cruel. You embarrassed our family." Then Madison's. You've always been dramatic, but that was next level." I didn't reply to any of them. By noon, Daniel was at my door. He didn't ring right away, he just stood there. When I finally opened it, he looked exhausted, eyes shadowed, voice low. "Why didn't you tell me it got this bad?" he asked. I wanted to tell him I had over and over in 1,000 small ways. Every sigh, every long silence, every time I covered for him had been my way of telling him. But he had never heard it. He reached out for my hand and I stepped back. "I can't do this anymore," I said softly. He nodded, maybe understanding for the first time. He left a note later that day. No apology, just confusion and regret written between the lines. I folded it and placed it in a drawer I didn't plan to open again. That weekend, I closed the joint credit card and moved my savings into a personal account. I emailed my HR department and requested a week off. When I finally turned off my phone, the silence felt strange, but clean. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. Each day of that week unfolded like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I made coffee, slowly let the radio fill the kitchen with soft music, walked outside without makeup, and felt the air on my skin. Nobody asked me to plan anything or fix anyone's mistakes. No one expected me to pay for a single thing. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew what wooden apologies that came too late, laughter at my expense, or the weight of being useful instead of loved. The next time my phone rang, I let it go to voicemail. The next time I saw a restaurant bill, it wouldn't be a test of my worth. I was finally learning what silence could sound like when it belonged to me. And just when I started to believe I could live in that peace, Daniel sent one last message, one that would force me to decide if the door I'd closed that night was meant to stay shut forever. Daniel's message sat unread for 2 days before I finally opened it. He said he was sorry that he didn't realize how much I was carrying. He wanted to talk to explain, but what was left to explain after years of silence, I didn't answer. Instead, I spent those days sitting in the quiet, trying to remember what peace even sounded like. The apartment felt different without the constant pull of his family's demands. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. On the third morning, I brewed coffee and opened the laptop, still sitting on the dining table. The spreadsheet stared back at me, neat columns of numbers and names, every dinner, every trip, every favor. I scrolled through it slowly, remembering each line like a small bruise. 78 events, $97,640.18. 3 years of effort that no one had seen as generosity, only expectation. I should have felt angry, but all I felt was tired. I deleted the file and watched the screen go blank. That part of my life was over. I spent the next few weeks rebuilding small pieces of myself. I walked every morning before work just to feel the air again. I started cooking for one, something I hadn't done since before the Crawfords made every meal a performance. There were no elaborate table settings now, no need to impress anyone. I ate simply quietly, and it felt like healing. The apartment, once just a place I came home to, began to feel like mine. Still, I couldn't ignore the ache that lingered when I thought of Daniel. We had built a life that looked whole from the outside, but I knew now it had been held together by denial. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd given up trying to make his family love me. That realization came slowly, like light, creeping into a dark room. A week later, Daniel asked to meet in person. We met at a small park near the river, the same one where we used to walk when we first dated. He looked older than I remembered, shoulders slumped, eyes shadowed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "I started therapy. I'm trying to understand why I let them control everything." His voice cracked on the last word. I nodded, unsure how to respond. It was too late for us to fix what had been broken, but I could see that he finally understood. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said. "I thought keeping the peace meant protecting you." I looked at him, realizing how small that peace had been, fragile, conditional, and built on my silence. "I believe you," I said, "but I can't go back to pretending everything's fine." He didn't argue. We sat in the quiet, listening to the wind move through the trees. When he finally stood, he said, "You were always stronger than me." Then he walked away, and I knew it was the last time I'd see him as my husband. The following days unfolded in quiet waves. I cleaned the apartment top to bottom, not out of restlessness, but to clear space for something new. The rooms echoed differently now, lighter, less burdened. I canceled the Crawfords' upcoming charity dinner from my calendar, deleted their group chat, and changed my number. Each small act felt like closing a door that had been left open too long. Without constant noise, I began to hear myself again. One evening, while sorting through old receipts, I found a folder of bank statements from the years I had supported the family. For a moment, I considered throwing them away. Then an idea began to take shape, not out of revenge, but out of purpose. What if I could help other women who'd been in my position, those who gave everything in relationships or families that only took? That night, I opened a blank document and wrote the first outline for something new. I didn't have a name for it yet, but it would become a quiet project, financial literacy coaching for women trapped in situations where money had become control. I reached out to a few contacts from work who shared similar interests, and within weeks, we began shaping a small foundation privately funded, no publicity attached. It wasn't about recognition. It was about giving power back to people who had lost it without realizing. Days turned into weeks, and life began to settle into a rhythm. I met friends for dinner, women who had once said, "You've changed since you married into that family," and I had brushed them off. Now, sitting across from them, I could finally admit they'd been right. We talked and laughed, splitting the check evenly without awkward glances. It was such a small thing, but it felt like freedom. On weekends, I traveled alone, short trips to places I'd always postponed visiting. In Sedona, I hiked under a sky so wide it made my chest ache. At night, I sat by the window of a small inn, writing notes about the past few years. I wasn't writing to publish or to prove anything. I was writing to remember how I got here. I thought about the Crawfords sometimes. I wondered if Patricia still hosted her perfect dinners, if Madison had found someone else to hand the check to. Maybe they told the story differently. Maybe I was the difficult one now. But it didn't matter. I had stopped living inside their version of the truth. Months passed before Daniel reached out again. His message was simple. "I've started therapy. You were right." They controlled everything, including me. There was no plea, no promise, just acknowledgement. I stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone down without replying. Healing didn't have to include reconciliation. In the quiet of those months, I learned to find joy in ordinary things: the sound of rain against the window, the warmth of sunlight on the kitchen counter, the way my small home smelled like coffee and fresh linen. I wasn't rebuilding a life. I was building one for the first time. When the holidays arrived, the air felt still and calm. I didn't wait for an invitation or wonder if I'd hear from anyone. I decorated my own tree with lights. I chose cooked dinner for myself and watched the lake shimmer outside my window. There was no noise, no tension, just peace. It wasn't about proving I could survive without them. It was about knowing I didn't need to prove anything at all. But life has a way of testing peace when you least expect it. Early one morning, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, addressed in Daniel's handwriting. I stood at the kitchen counter, staring at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a stack of legal papers, the divorce agreement already signed. There was no bitterness in the pages, just finality. At the bottom was a short note. "I wish you happiness, Emily. You deserve it." I signed the papers that evening alone in the same spot where I had once typed every painful expense into a spreadsheet. It felt fitting somehow, the end of one ledger, the beginning of another kind of balance. When I sealed the envelope and placed it on the counter for pickup, I took a deep breath. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in years, so did I. I didn't know what the next chapter would bring, but I knew this much: I had stopped waiting for permission to live a life that felt like mine. And as I stood by the window, watching the last traces of sunlight fade over the lake, I felt something I hadn't in a very long time: relief that I had finally chosen myself, even if it meant starting over from nothing. What I didn't know then was that choosing peace would open doors I hadn't even known were locked, and that the strength I found in that stillness would carry me into a future brighter than anything the Crawfords could ever imagine. The morning after I signed the divorce papers, I stood at the window watching the mail truck pull away. The envelope I'd sent off the night before was gone, carrying the last piece of that life with it. There was no sadness left, just a strange, steady quiet that felt unfamiliar. The air in my apartment smelled like coffee and rain. I had opened every window, letting the breeze sweep through as if it could carry out the remnants of what I'd endured. Work came back into focus. Meetings, deadlines, quiet mornings where no one interrupted. The people at the office didn't know the details, but they could tell something had changed. I was lighter. I no longer rushed home to prepare for someone else's plans. My evenings were mine again. I spent them reading or walking along the lake, learning how to fill time with peace instead of obligation. One afternoon, my colleague and friend Lisa Monroe stopped by my desk. She had worked beside me for years and had been there through most of the silent unraveling I'd never fully explained. "You seem different," she said softly. "In a good way." I smiled, knowing she was right. That weekend, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened my notebook. It wasn't the ledger anymore. It was a blank page. I began sketching ideas for the foundation I'd been planning, the one meant to help women understand their finances, especially those who had been made to feel powerless in their own lives. I called it the Balance Project. It started small, a handful of private workshops at the community center downtown, free of charge. I didn't advertise my name anywhere. I wanted the work to stand on its own. The first session had only 6 women. They arrived quietly, most of them nervous, clutching old bank statements and stories they weren't sure they could say out loud. I recognized their expressions, half shame, half exhaustion. I saw the version of myself who had once believed silence was strength. As they spoke, I listened. We worked through practical steps, budgeting, separating personal accounts, building confidence with money. But something else happened too. They began to sit taller, to speak louder. When the class ended, one woman lingered at the door. Her name was Claire. She said I thought I was the only one who felt like this. I shook my head. "You're not," I told her. "You never were." The sessions grew through word of mouth. Within months, the Balance Project had partnered with 2 local nonprofits, and we began reaching women who had been trapped in controlling relationships or families where generosity was used as a leash. Seeing them find their footing again became my quiet purpose. Every time one of them opened a new account or said no for the first time, I felt something inside me mend a little more. Still reminders of the Crawfords found their way back in small ways. A mutual friend mentioned that Patricia had been telling people I'd left Daniel for money or pride, depending on the day. Madison apparently had taken over planning family events and made sure everyone knew she was now handling things. I could have been angry, but I wasn't. Their world hadn't changed. Mine had. A few weeks later, I received a voicemail from Daniel. His voice was calm, almost hesitant. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "I've been approved to start a new project at work. It's small, but I'm proud of it. I'm getting better." There was a pause before he added, "You were right to leave." I listened once, then deleted it. It wasn't coldness, it was closure. Life began to feel simple again. I hosted quiet dinners with friends who valued presence over performance. No one measured generosity by receipts or appearances. We shared meals, laughter, and long conversations that didn't end with someone handing me the bill. For the first time in years, I didn't brace for the moment when kindness turned into expectation. One Saturday morning, I went to the farmer's market. The sun was warm, the kind that glowed through leaves and made everything look softer. As I browsed through the stalls, someone called my name. I turned and saw Madison standing a few feet away. She was dressed impeccably as always, but her expression wasn't smug, it was tired. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "Daniel told me about the divorce. I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. I didn't answer right away. The noise of the market filled the silence between us. Finally, I said I did. She nodded, eyes dropping to the ground. Mom says you embarrassed the family, but..." She stopped, searching for words. "I guess you were just braver than the rest of us." I didn't know what to say to that. She looked thinner, worn around the edges, as if the weight of that family's perfection had started to press down on her, too. "Take care of yourself, Madison," I said simply. Then I walked away. I didn't look back. That night I sat by the window watching the lights on the water. It struck me how much had changed in less than a year. The woman who once stayed quiet to keep peace had stood up, spoken out, and walked away from everything that once defined her. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. As winter approached, the Balance Project reached its first milestone. 50 women enrolled 12 graduates who had gone on to start small businesses or return to school. I celebrated quietly with a cup of coffee and a folder of handwritten thank you notes they had sent me. Each one was a reminder of how far I'd come from that night at the restaurant, standing in front of a family who thought my silence meant compliance. One of the notes stood out. It was from Claire, the woman from that first session. She wrote, "You helped me remember who I was before I started apologizing for existing." I read it twice, then tucked it in the drawer beside the divorce papers. It felt like the end of one story and the beginning of another. Around that time, Daniel sent me one final letter. It wasn't long, just a single page. He said he'd finished therapy, had learned to set boundaries with his mother, and had started volunteering at a local shelter, teaching financial skills to young men leaving foster care. He ended it with, "You were right. I had to learn how to stand up too." I folded the letter and placed it with Claire's note. Both belonged to the same chapter lessons born from endings. By spring, I moved into a small house near the lake. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was filled with light and quiet. The walls smelled faintly of cedar, and the backyard bloomed with lavender I planted myself. I no longer needed marble countertops or approval to feel proud of where I lived. On one of my morning walks, a woman stopped me to compliment my earrings. She smiled and said, "You look like someone who knows exactly who she is." I thanked her, and as I continued walking, I realized I finally believed it. I didn't know if the Crawfords still mentioned my name or told stories about the night I stood up to them. Maybe they still laughed about it. Maybe they pretended it never happened. Either way, it no longer mattered. The silence I once feared had become the space where I rebuilt myself. And in that silence, I began to understand the quiet kind of justice, the kind that doesn't need witnesses or applause. The kind that comes when you finally stop explaining, stop defending, and simply live a life that no longer asks for permission. What came next wasn't about revenge or forgiveness. It was about peace and learning that sometimes the most powerful statement a person can make is to walk away and never look back. Spring came early that year, and with it a feeling of lightness I hadn't known in years. My small house by the lake was finally furnished, nothing grand, just pieces that felt like me. Sunlight spilled through the kitchen each morning, glinting off the water outside. I would brew coffee, open the window, and breathe in the scent of the pine trees that lined the shore. It was quiet, simple, and mine. The kind of peace I used to think only existed in other people's lives. The Balance Project continued to grow one careful step at a time. What had started as evening workshops at the community center now included online sessions and mentoring circles. I partnered with a financial advisor named Gwen Peterson, a calm, insightful woman in her 50s, who'd spent most of her career teaching rural women about independence. She reminded me of what strength looked like when it didn't need to be loud. Together, we built a small network of volunteers who shared our mission to teach women how to protect their money, their time, and their worth. Gwen became more than a partner. She was the kind of person who carried quiet wisdom in her eyes. One evening, after a long day of planning, she looked at me and said, "You know, Emily, you don't owe anyone a happy ending with them. Sometimes closure is just peace that stays." Her words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. That summer, the Balance Project received a small feature in a local magazine. It wasn't a headline story, just a half-page piece titled "From Ledgers to Liberation," but it felt like a full-circle moment. When the article came out, I thought little of it. Until a few days later, I got a message. It was from Daniel. He wrote, "I saw the article. You look happy. I'm proud of you." The message was brief, polite, and unassuming. I stared at it for a long while before responding with 2 words. "Thank you." It wasn't bitterness or nostalgia, it was acknowledgement. A small, clean end to a story that no longer needed retelling. Life had begun to move forward in its own quiet rhythm, and I was learning to move with it. I started spending weekends at the local farmers market, helping vendors manage their budgets as part of the foundation's outreach. Some mornings the air smelled of fresh bread and lavender. others of rain on canvas tents. People there knew me only as Emily, the woman who taught money workshops. No one's wife, no one's daughter-in-law, just me. But one Friday afternoon, as I was packing up after a session, I received a voicemail that unsettled the calm I'd built. It was from an unknown number, but the voice was unmistakable. "Emily, this is Patricia Crawford." I froze. "Daniel told me about your work. We're hosting a benefit dinner next month for women's education programs. I'd like you to attend. It would mean a great deal to him." I didn't respond right away. For years I had replayed her voice in my head, the tone that could turn a sentence into a judgment. Hearing it again was like walking into a room I'd already burned down. I deleted the message, but it lingered in my thoughts for days. Then a second call came, this time from Daniel. "Mom's serious about the invitation," he said. "She wants to make peace. I think she's realized what she lost." I listened quietly. "Daniel," I said finally, "your mother doesn't apologize. She hosts events. That's not the same thing." He sighed. "Maybe it's not, but maybe it's a start." That night I sat by the lake, the envelope of his last letter still tucked in the drawer beside me. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to stay far away from everything that had hurt me. But another part, the one that had spent years being silenced, wanted to walk back in, not for them, but for me. To end it on my terms. 3 weeks later, I walked into the same restaurant where it had all begun, the place where Madison had once told me to pay for it. The Crawfords were hosting their charity gala there, now polished as ever. Crystal chandeliers, wine glasses, gleaming photographers at the door. For a moment, I stood in the lobby, watching the familiar scene play out. The staff, the laughter, the practiced smiles. It felt almost like stepping into a memory that didn't belong to me anymore. Daniel spotted me first. He approached, uncertain but warm. "You came," he said quietly. "Thank you." "I'm not here for your mother," I said. "I'm here because this is where it started, and I needed to know I could walk in and feel nothing." He nodded, understanding more than he said. Across the room, Patricia stood in her usual grace pearls, shining under the chandelier. Madison hovered beside her, still poised, still performing. They both noticed me, their smiles freezing for just a moment. Then Patricia walked over. "Emily," she said smoothly, her voice perfectly modulated. "You look, well." "So do you," I answered. "I hope there are no hard feelings." She began, placing a manicured hand on my arm. "Family disagreements happen. I'd hate for the past to overshadow what we're doing tonight." I smiled faintly. "There are no hard feelings," I said. "Just boundaries. I wish you well with the event." Her expression tightened, the kind of polite tension that comes when control slips through your fingers. "You're welcome to stay for dinner," she offered. "No," I said gently. "I'm just here to drop something off." I reached into my bag and handed her a plain white envelope. She looked down at it, puzzled. "It's the final receipt for the venue," I said. "You might not remember, but I booked it the first time you came here. Consider it my last contribution to the Crawford family." Her hand trembled just slightly. I turned, gave Daniel a small nod, and walked toward the door. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. The sound of laughter and music followed me out, but it didn't sting anymore. As I stepped into the streetlight, I realized I had just rewritten the moment that once broke me. I had walked in, stood tall, and left not as their benefactor, not as their victim, but as myself. When I got home that night, I brewed tea and sat by the window, the moon reflecting over the still water. I thought about everything that had led to this, the years of trying to earn love, the silence I mistook for grace, the price I paid for belonging. And I thought about what came after the freedom of walking away without bitterness, of closing a door without slamming it. The next morning, Gwen stopped by with fresh pastries and coffee. I told her what had happened, and she smiled, setting her cup down. "That was your real balance sheet," she said. "Not money dignity, and you came out ahead." I laughed softly. She was right. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. Later that day, I received a message from Daniel. No apologies, no guilt, just a simple sentence. "You were right. Some debts can't be repaid, only acknowledged." I read it twice, then deleted it. My life no longer needed reminders of where I'd been. The world outside my window was bright, the lake calm and steady. I watched the sunlight shift across the water and realized I was standing exactly where I was meant to be. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, the future didn't scare me, because I finally understood that freedom doesn't always come from walking away. It comes from knowing you never have to go back. And somewhere deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of a life that finally belonged entirely to me. Summer deepened into long, quiet days by the lake. I learned to measure time not by meetings or family gatherings, but by the sound of wind through the trees and the way the water caught the morning light. For the first time in years, peace wasn't a fleeting visitor. It had moved in and stayed. I had stopped counting what I'd lost and started seeing what I had rebuilt. The Balance Project grew faster than I expected. What began as small community sessions turned into a regional program with weekly workshops and online mentoring. Gwen and I started training volunteers to lead classes in nearby towns, many of them women who had once sat in those same folding chairs clutching old bank statements and stories they had been afraid to tell. Watching them teach others was its own quiet reward, a circle of strength spreading farther than I could have imagined. One afternoon in August, I received an email from a journalist named Rebecca Flores from a national lifestyle magazine. She'd heard about the program through one of our partner organizations and wanted to feature it in their Women Rebuilding series. My first instinct was to decline. I had kept the work deliberately private, wanting the focus to stay on the women we served. But Gwen encouraged me to say yes. People need to see that this kind of healing is possible, she said. It's not about recognition, it's about permission. A month later, the article went live. It wasn't sensational, just a thoughtful piece about empowerment, dignity, and reclaiming financial control. The writer mentioned how the foundation was born from my own experience with family imbalance, but she kept the details kind and general. When I read it, I felt something I hadn't in years: validation without exposure. Messages began to pour in. Dozens of emails from women across the country thanking us for the work, sharing stories of survival, courage, and quiet beginnings. One message came from an unfamiliar address, short and simple. I read the article. "I'm proud of you. Daniel." I stared at it for a long while, then closed my laptop. A week later, Daniel called. His voice was calm, steady. "I just wanted to tell you in person," he said. "I've been in therapy for a year now. I finally understand what you meant about boundaries. I let my family shape my silence. There was no pleading, no regret, just recognition. You were right," he continued. "We couldn't have saved the marriage, but I'm grateful you didn't let me drag you down with me." I didn't know what to say for a moment. Finally, I said, "I'm glad you're doing the work." It wasn't closure that came from forgiveness. It was closure that came from truth. That fall, Daniel and I met one last time at a quiet cafe halfway between his office and my home. We spoke like two people who had shared a life, but no longer shared its weight. He told me about his new apartment, how he'd taken up hiking again. He said his mother still tried to control every detail of his life, but now he didn't let her. "Therapy helped me see how much of my voice I gave away," he said. "I think I'm finally ready to start living as my own man." I nodded. "That's all I ever wanted for you." When we left, he paused before walking to his car. "You were the first person who ever told me no," he said softly. "At the time, I thought it was rejection. Now I know it was love." I watched him drive away, and instead of sadness, I felt peace. The kind that comes from knowing a chapter has truly closed, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. That evening, I went home and sat on the porch, the air cool with the first hint of autumn. Across the lake, the trees were beginning to shift into gold and amber. I thought about everything that had led here, the nights of doubt, the silence at the Crawford table, the laughter that had once stung. All of it had built the woman I had become, one boundary at a time. In November, the Balance Project hosted its first statewide summit. Nearly 100 women attended: teachers, nurses, single mothers, and small business owners. We held panels on budgeting, credit rebuilding, and emotional resilience. When it ended, the applause wasn't loud or showy. It was the kind of sound that carries gratitude in its tone. Gwen stood beside me on stage, beaming. "You did this," she whispered. I shook my head. "We did this." After the event, Rebecca the journalist stopped by to congratulate us. "People need to hear stories like yours," she said. "Not the dramatic ones, the real ones where healing doesn't look perfect, but still matters." That night when I got home, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window looking out over the lake. The moonlight scattered over the surface like a silver path. I realized I had finally stopped waiting for anyone to notice what I'd built. The validation I had chased for years had quietly turned inward. A few days later, I received one final letter from Patricia Crawford. The handwriting was elegant, the stationery thick and perfumed her signature style. She thanked me for attending the charity gala months earlier, said she admired what I was doing for women and hoped we could move forward without ill feelings. It was the closest she would ever come to an apology. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer beside the others. I didn't need to respond. Some words are better left resting in silence. The following weekend, I met with Gwen and a small team of volunteers to plan next year's expansion. We were applying for a national grant to fund rural education programs, something I'd never imagined when I first opened that spreadsheet years ago. As we sat around the table surrounded by notebooks and coffee cups, Gwen looked at me with a soft smile. "You know," she said, "this project isn't just helping others, it's helping you stay free." She was right. Every decision, every class, every woman who learned to say no was another reminder that I had escaped a life that once defined me by what I gave. When the meeting ended, I walked outside and stood in the crisp afternoon air. The sun was low, painting the trees in shades of orange and rose. I thought of the countless nights I'd spent convincing myself I wasn't enough those evenings when I'd measured my worth in receipts and polite nods. Now standing there, I felt whole without needing to be seen. As winter settled in, the world slowed. I decorated the house for the holidays with simple garlands and soft white lights. There were no invitations, no demands, no guilt. Just peace. On Christmas morning, I woke to a quiet snowfall, the kind that muffles the world. I brewed coffee and watched the flakes drift onto the lake. It was a small, beautiful moment, one that needed no audience. That afternoon, an email arrived confirming the Balance Project's nomination for a regional civic award. I smiled as I read it, not because of recognition, but because it meant more women would hear about the work. The girl who once measured worth in family approval had built something that lived beyond her name. As the day ended, I lit a candle by the window and whispered a quiet thank you not to the Crawfords, not even to Daniel, but to the woman who had finally chosen herself. I didn't know yet what the next year would bring: new faces, new challenges, maybe even new love. But I knew this: the part of me that once sought permission was gone. In its place stood a woman who finally understood that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply says, "I'm done," and means it. The lake outside shimmered under the last light of day, calm and endless. Somewhere in that reflection, I saw the life I had built, not perfect, but peaceful. And for the first time, that was more than enough. What came next wasn't about survival anymore. It was about living. And as I turned off the light and stepped away from the window, I felt the certainty that the story I once thought ended in loss had only just begun to bloom. The first days of the new year arrived quietly. Snow covered the lake in a smooth white sheet, and the air outside my windows felt still, almost sacred. Inside my home was warm and peaceful, filled with the scent of cedar and morning coffee. Life had slowed into something steady, something that belonged entirely to me. The Balance Project had reached more people than I ever imagined. Gwen and I had just finished reviewing our first full-year report. Hundreds of women supported, dozens of local partnerships formed, and stories that still made me tear up every time I read them. There were teachers who rebuilt their savings, single mothers who bought their first homes, and women in their 60s who finally opened accounts in their own names after decades of dependency. Every number on that page meant a life reclaimed. When we closed the meeting that afternoon, Gwen hugged me and said, "You turned pain into something people can stand on." I smiled because it was true. For years I had been measured by what I gave away. Now I was defined by what I built, and no one could take that from me. Later that evening, I took a walk down to the frozen shoreline. The world was quiet, except for the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots. I thought about everything that had led me here, the years of shrinking to fit into other people's comfort, the laughter that had stung like glass, the silence I once thought was peace. It all felt distant now, like a story I used to tell myself to fall asleep. A few days after the summit, a small envelope arrived in the mail. The handwriting on it was familiar Patricia's. I opened it slowly, half expecting another polished note filled with empty pleasantries. But this one was short, almost bare. She wrote, "I was wrong about you. I see that now. Daniel is doing well, and I think you'd be proud. I wish you peace." For a long moment I stood by the window, the letter in my hands. There were no tears this time, no ache for approval, just understanding. People change when they're ready, not when we demand it. I folded the note and slipped it into the same drawer that held Daniel's letter and the first thank you cards from the women we helped. It felt right for all of them to rest together chapters of the same long story. That weekend I hosted a small dinner at my house for a few close friends. Nothing extravagant, just soup simmering on the stove, warm bread, soft music, and laughter that filled the room without hurting anyone. At one point, Lisa raised her glass and said, "To Emily for proving you can start over at any age and make it look easy." Everyone laughed, but I shook my head. "It wasn't easy," I said quietly. "It was necessary." After they left, I sat alone for a while, watching the reflection of the candles fade across the table. There was a time when I believed love meant endurance, when I thought giving more would eventually make me worthy of being seen. Now I understood that real love doesn't ask you to disappear. It meets you where you stand and still wants you whole. I thought of Daniel then, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. He had begun his own healing, and in a way that was the final proof that leaving had been the right choice. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to stop enabling the people we care about, to let the silence teach what words never could. The next morning, I returned to the lake. The ice was beginning to crack near the edges, the first signs of spring underneath the frost. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the cold air, feeling the sunlight brush against my face. For the first time, I didn't think about what came next. I just felt present, alive, free. I knew people like the Crawfords might still tell their version of the story, the one where I was ungrateful, selfish, difficult. But that was fine. Let them. The truth didn't need defending anymore. It lived quietly in every boundary I'd learned to hold, in every woman who walked into the Balance Project and walked out taller. I had finally learned that being generous isn't about how much you give. It's about knowing when to stop giving to those who only take. Because being the one who always pays doesn't mean you're valued. It just means you're available. And I'm not anymore. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, I turned back toward the house. The windows glowed softly in the fading light, and for a moment I caught my reflection in the glass, steady content no longer defined by what I'd lost. I smiled to myself, realizing I had become everything I once needed, secure, calm, and whole. If you've ever had to reclaim your worth after being taken for granted, I hope my story reminds you of this peace. Doesn't come from being needed, it comes from being free. And if that truth resonates with you, take a deep breath, hold your head high, and share this story with someone who might need to hear it too. Because sometimes the quietest kind of justice is simply walking away and never apologizing for it.